When you first approached me about discussing trainers and their history and their impact on fashion, I thought about it and I realised straight away that it was almost too big of a topic to cover. So I thought the best way to do it would be to hone it down to one particular shoe, and chose the Adidas Stan Smith. And I thought that taking a shoe that was primarily designed for sport but whose history has touched so many different areas of popular culture, it would almost serve as a vehicle to talk about the bigger picture of what has happened with, you know, the growth in popularity of athletic footwear as a lifestyle shoe that's kind of been taking place over the last 4 decades. I mean, when the Stan Smith was first created, that is kind of a tricky question. The shoe itself was originally designed in the 1960s, in an era where no one could have imagined that 50 years later it had become what it is now. And there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of different dates around. There's issues regarding predecessors, prototypes, new names, different launch dates in certain markets. But what we do know is that Stan Smith personally wore a shoe called the Adidas High Air, which would eventually become Stan's signature shoe in 1972 after he won the Wimbledon tournament. So when he won Wimbledon in 72, he was wearing this shoe which is called the High Air, which was named after a tennis champion in the 60s. But to make it even more confusing, the High Air had a name prior to being the High Air. For the purposes of this film, I didn't actually have a pair of vintage High Airs to hand. I do have, I guess these are vintage now because they came from Japan in 1999 and they were made exclusively for Japan. We exhibited my Special trainer exhibition in Paris last year, and we had a host of different Stan Smiths that were contributed by local collectors. And when we compared the High Air reissue from Japan in 1999 to the vintage High Air, we noticed that the signature, his name is spelled R-O-L-A-T on this Japanese edition when his name was Robert. So it's quite amusing that you get these little trips and mistakes as time goes on, and in a funny sort of way it adds to the appeal of them for me. The High Air name was still used alongside the Stan Smith name in the early 70s. So these shoes are extremely rare, but you can find shoes that have got the High Air name on the side and Stan's face on the tongue. These shoes are very collectible and they call them the High Air Smith. The first Adidas catalogue, according to the Adidas archive in Germany, in which Stan Smith was solely used for this particular shoe, appeared in 1973 for the season 1974. And this was actually one of the reasons why that contributed towards Adidas choosing 2014 as the year when they would bring the Stan Smith back to market, because it was actually an anniversary year. It was kind of commemorating that shoe going into market solely under the Stan Smith name. People began wearing the Stan Smith for other reasons, I guess. In the seedlings of that were in the late 60s, but it's kind of in the 70s when it really started to happen. The late 60s, to wear athletic footwear for lifestyle was an incredibly radical way to dress. The first thing I've actually seen is on the single cover of Strawberry Fields, the Beatles' Strawberry Fields, John Lennon's wearing a pair of Adidas trainers. And that came out around 1968. But then as it goes into the 70s, it starts to pick up momentum. So like the Rolling Stones on their 1972 Exile on Main Street tour were wearing Adidas SL72s. Keith Moon used to wear Adidas Gazelles. Jim Morrison was wearing Adidas trainers around that time. When there's some pictures of him when he was playing touch football. Sly from Sly and the Family Stone. So the trainers started to appear on a few music artists in the early 70s. Now, bearing in mind, we've been talking about the 60s. Nike doesn't even come into existence until the early 70s. So all this is going on already before Phil Knight's even kind of appeared with his running shoes. But I think the first non-athletic culture that really picked up on sportswear was probably reggae culture. and that was through Bob Marley, which would have been driven by his love of football. So essentially it was coming from sport, but Bob and the Whalers and his entourage were all kind of wearing not only trainers, but they were also wearing, adopting the complete look of sports apparel and footwear and wearing them for lifestyle. As far as the Stan Smith goes, coming back to the Stan Smith, the first time I can see that it really appears culturally, and I'm sure there'll be somebody out there that can correct me on this, but David Bowie wore white Stan Smiths with like a shirt and chinos for some of the press shots that he did around sort of Station to Station era, which was kind of mid-70s. John Lennon also wore black Stan Smiths. In the months leading up to his death, you see a lot of pictures of Lennon wearing sort of leather flying jacket with black Stan Smiths. But the interesting thing about the Bowie thing is, and since I got thinking about this, around the time sort of, Station to Station, Lord, The Man Who Fell to Earth, that was a real touch point for the change in football fashion that was born out of the Northwest. And I'm not going to get into the arguments whether it happened in Manchester or whether it happened in Liverpool. It was most definitely happening in Liverpool, that's for sure. And but around 1978, Liverpool fans kind of took on the Stan Smith and started to wear the Stan Smith. Now, bearing in mind that this was a complete departure from the skinhead, suede head, boot boy look that football fans have worn through the 70s, and these guys have gone for a completely different take. No scarves, no team colours, very kind of effeminate wedge hairstyles, duffel coats, anoraks, straight jeans Accords and Adidas trainers. It was a completely revolutionary look, and in many ways that kind of set the agenda for British streetwear for right up to now, really. It's still, the influence of that, it's almost like, they threw a pebble in the pond and the ripples of that are still happening through to this day. The Stan Smith has, continued to be popular with football fans on and off ever since. But, the popularity of Stan Smith has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, In the 1990s, I personally wore Stan Smiths a lot, but they weren't actually ranged here in the UK. But the shoe from its very, very beginning has always maintained huge popularity in France. They were always available there, so I'd always pick them up when I was over in Paris. And the interesting thing with it in France is that it's very democratic in the way that it's worn, in so much as you've got the kind of, the kids out in the suburbs who were sort of, head to toe in sportswear, who listen to hip hop, kind of French b-boys, wear Stan Smith. At the same time, you've got the kind of gallery curators and the high fashion people who are sort of floating around Colette wearing Stan Smith. But it seems to be, because of its design language and because of its versatility, it seems to sort of cross every sort of barrier, if you will, of social class. But that whole period of the 90s where shoes like, Adidas was absolutely huge in the UK at that point, with Gazelles and Campuses and the whole Britpop thing. But Stan Smith was kind of, I wouldn't say forgotten, but it wasn't readily available. It wasn't ranged here. The thing that happened in the 2000s was that Stan Smith started to become really popular again. But what happened was the market became saturated. There was such a lot of them out there, and the people at Adidas sat down and realised that the Stan Smith is actually one of the crown jewels of that company. It is one of the undisputed design classics of that company. For me personally, I think it is the ultimate design classic of that company, and possibly, arguably, of any brand. And so what they wanted to do was basically clean up the distribution and get away from this, oversaturated, overly available shoe that was kind of, the Stan Smith, they didn't want to see the Stan Smith sitting on discount racks. So they made a decision to stop production of them, which was an incredibly bold move. And it took a couple of years after them stopping production for supplies to really begin to dry out, because there was such a lot of them out there. So, you know, if you looked hard enough in sort of discount sport retailers, you might find a pair of Stan Smiths, but it became harder and harder to find them before they actually decided to sort of reposition them and relaunch them in 2014. What they did with the 2014 relaunch, they studied all the different versions of Stan Smiths and decided to try and take some of the best elements of them all and put that into one shoe. But most Stan Smiths that you see around now are very inspired by the 80s Stan Smiths more than the 70s Stan Smiths. The shoes in the 70s were made on very different lasts to what shoes are made on nowadays. And so that's why a lot of the time, a lot of the vintage shoes seem to have a slightly different shape in the upper than a lot of modern trainers do. Around the late 90s, I would travel to Tokyo, and that, to my knowledge, Japan was the only Adidas country in the world that were doing Stan Smith 1 season in, season out. So the difference between the Stan Smith 1 and the Stan Smith 2 essentially is there's a host of very subtle differences, but the way you can spot it a mile off is the difference in the tongue. On the Stan Smith 1, you've got this portrait of Stan's face. On the Stan Smith 2, you've got a different material in the tongue. It's a padded tongue, and you've got a linear Adidas logo with Stan Smith written underneath, patched onto the top of it. Interesting bit of trivia, I met Stan Smith once, and I was talking to him about, you know, the history of his shoe and how he felt about it. And he told me a story that not many people know this, but the picture of Stan Smith on the tongue, Stan hasn't got a moustache. Stan Smith in his adult life has only ever been without a moustache for one 6-month period. That happened to be the 6-month period when Adidas took his picture and did his portrait for his shoe, which has ended up being this shoe that has gone out to millions and millions of people worldwide. But Stan himself isn't really accurately represented in his own portrait. It's quite an interesting bit of trivia. Japan was the only place with the Stan Smith 1s in the range, and they had them in a selection of colours. So you would have the white shoe with a green back, which is the original version, but then there's a red back and then the blue back, and then I've seen Stan Smith 2s with brown backs, pink backs. And the thing is with Stan Smith, it's just these real subtle nuances and differences in them that a lot of people probably wouldn't notice. They also would have Stan Smith 1s in completely coloured versions, like all red, all black, all blue. And it was almost like, you know, in Japan they wanted the purest form of the shoes. The shoe has had this really odd trajectory from sports to music culture to fashion. And why that is very difficult to pinpoint. I think that the fact it's got such understated design leaves it open to interpretation. So, you know, we talk about football casuals in the late 70s, or Perry Boys or Scallies or whatever you want to call them in the UK. I mean, if you look at Kevin Sampson wrote the book Away Days. His lead character, Carty, in that book and in the film, wears Stan Smith shoes. But then, you know, in the 80s and 90s, it kind of became popularised within hip-hop. And, you know, a lot of people nowadays talk about, you know, the sneaker culture. And, you know, sneaker is essentially an American word, and they're talking about an American culture. But there's been a lot of different sportswear, trainer, athletic footwear, whatever you like to call it, cultures that were happening prior to hip-hop. You know, if you look at pictures of early rappers, they almost look like people from the disco era more than the way we know rappers now. And it was only when people like Run DMC came along that rappers started to adopt a street look. They took their look from what they were seeing going on around them. And, you know, Run DMC and Adidas was essentially the first non-athletic collaboration by any sportswear brand, and that took place in the 80s. That was so far ahead of its time based on, you know, what we see going on nowadays. But once it gets to the 90s, you know, there's there's things like Jay-Z rapped about them on his Blueprint album. You know, when I met Stan Smith was saying how his grandkids had come round to his house and they all think Grandad's really cool now because Jay-Z rapped about him. And so, you know, there's a lyric in one of the tracks on there, a track that mentions the word jigger in the title, and he talks about lamping in the Hamptons, the Weekends Man, the Stan Smith Adidas and the Campus, playing Guts on the Cruise, Hermes bought shoes, the Izod bucket on, I'm so old school. So it's, you know, Stan was quite pleased about that because it made him look good amongst his family. The other thing that's really started to happen with the Stan Smith and that we've seen over the past couple of decades is the sort of high fashion crowd really picked up on it. Ray from Comme des Garçons, it was a shoe that she wore all the time pretty much. It was almost became like her signature shoe. And I think, you know, like I say, the simplicity of its design gives it its versatility. You know, Stan Smith design is extremely modernist. There's nothing added that doesn't need to be there. The branding's minimal. You know, it opts for perforations that suggest the three stripes rather than the stripes themselves. You know, and everything about the design of a Stan Smith, you'd say, is kind of it's restrained and it's understated. I couldn't actually pinpoint when the first Adidas Stan Smith collaboration was, but I know it's going to have happened in the past 10 years. There's been so many different ones. I couldn't begin to tell you. You know, there've been collaborations with streetwear brands like Neighborhood, 84 Lab, Mastermind, Club 75, 10 Deep, right up to now with the White Mountaineering, high fashion designers, people like Raf Simons, Yohji Yamamoto. Even if you look at the Rick Owens Adidas collaboration, he's obviously taken some influence from the Stan Smith because he's branded the shoe using the perforations on the side. So, you know, its influence is so far reaching. The thing I love about the Raf Simons Stan Smiths is they seem to make a statement about design in so much as design is often about what you don't add rather than what you do add, and to leave the shoe in its classic form but just to play with the perforations and make a play on the perforations to just put them into an R, but to leave everything exactly as it was, for me is a really powerful statement about that shoe, because it's kind of like, it's almost like Raf is saying this shoe can't be bettered. There's nothing you can do to improve on this shoe where it is, and just makes his own little signature in there, but uses the design language of the Stan Smith to make that point. You know, and when it came to relaunching in 2014, here in London, Adidas sponsored an art exhibition called Platform 6, and they wanted to give all the proceeds to Stonewall, and they had a few people that said they wanted to contribute to the exhibition. So the idea was the Stan Smith was given to a number of different contributors as a blank canvas for them to customise, and then they auctioned the money and gave the money to Stonewall. So they got everybody from the Chapman brothers to Judy Blame to Elton John to Naomi Campbell to basically take the shoe with this blank canvas idea. On top of that, there was a Kate Moss shoe that was auctioned, but Adidas produced a special run of Kate Moss Stan Smiths. They made a quantity for Kate's family and friends, and they auctioned 10 signed pairs in the Platform 6 exhibition. Not long after the Platform 6 exhibition in Paris, Pharrell Williams had been kind of made the Stan Smith his own and was wearing Stan Smiths that he would sort of scribble on or paint on or customise himself for a lot of his performances. So he did a quantity of unique, one-of-a-kind, hand-painted Stan Smiths that were auctioned for his charity through Colette. The thing with the Stan Smith is there's a lot of nuances to it, and the design has very, very subtly changed over time while still maintaining its original form and flavours. So even last year they took the prime knit technology and took the classic Stan Smith sole unit and put the used the prime knit technology to knit the upper of the shoe. 2002 saw the first Adidas Stan Smith high top, so there's an ankle boot version of them as well. But you had shoes like the Adidas Master, which looked at the Stan Smith Comfort upper, tweaked the upper with a couple of extra stitch lines and put the Stan Smith Comfort upper essentially onto a campus sole unit. There were shoes like the Adidas Official, which was a referee's shoe, which was made of boot leather, but again borrowed the design language of the Stan Smith by having the perforations in the side, but on a different sole unit. They became popular in the 70s. So there was a lot of offshoot shoes that came from Stan Smith. In the 90s in Japan, Adidas was produced under license by a company called Descente, and there was a range that was done for Japan only called Adidas Safety, which there was kind of a Stan Smith version of those, and they were kind of Adidas trainers that were designed for workmen, so they had sort of steel toe caps, like steel reinforced toe caps inside them. They were a Japan only release. And you know, for me, I would say it's the most iconic trainer style. It's been copied by so many high fashion designers, it's been copied by so many high street brands. To sum it up, the 1960s, the trainer was essentially a sports shoe, and we saw the very, very beginnings of it being picked up for lifestyle in the late 60s. The 70s, sportswear for lifestyle starts to gain momentum through music and youth cultures. The 80s, the adoption of sportswear for lifestyles in full swing, but there's very, very few collectors. I personally didn't know anybody that collected trainers in the 1980s. Everybody I know that wore trainers, you know, certainly me and my friends, we wore them till they were falling off our feet, and trainers at that time were something that you would buy from shops that sold tennis rackets and cricket bats, or fishing tackle and air rifles. It wasn't packaged in the way that it's packaged now. So it really was adoption back then. The first collaboration appeared in the 80s with Run DMC. Then the 90s, what starts to happen is the trainer athletic footwear starts to become more technical. There was technology happening through the 70s and through the 80s, but they start to look overtly technical. And there is still an audience out there who've been wearing trainers in that previous decade who long for the simplicity of the aesthetic of those shoes that were coming out in the 70s and 80s. So what starts to happen in the 90s is you get this phenomena of dead stock hunting. So people like Duffer St George started to bring Adidas trainers into the UK because Adidas had, in the early 90s, changed its logo from the trefoil to the performance logo and had started with a new equipment range. They were already bringing shoes in the late 80s. They'd started to bring them in from the US, primarily the Superstar. People like the Beastie Boys would brag about having sneaker pimps who would go out hunting dead stock for them. There's a famous Beastie Boys interview from the early 90s where it's Mike D and Ad Rock, and they're both talking about their campuses and showing their campuses and saying how they love the simplicity of the design and how that's what they seek out. So the companies hadn't quite figured out what was happening with the customers. Adidas started to produce some original shoes around the same time that they launched the equipment range. But I think it was only 5 styles, and it was pushed through by a guy called Peter Moore, who was the guy who was the sort of kind of creatively directed the whole equipment range. So you had these very early Adidas originals. I think it was the Gazelle, the Campus, the Superstar. It was a very small group of shoes. What started to happen as the 90s went on these shoes became more and more popular, and the dead stock began to dry up. This idea of guys going through the yellow pages, looking up, you know, what small independent sports stores, calling them up and saying, have you got any old shoes in your stock room, and buying up the old stock and then selling it on at a slightly inflated price. The stock started to dry up. And then as we get into the 2000s, that's when the companies really start to get wise to the value of reissues. You know, I remember Nike in the late 90s putting out a statement saying, we only look forward, we never look backwards. And yet, you know, you only have to look at what's happening now with the Jordan market. That statement doesn't really ring true anymore. So Adidas set up a separate division in the early 2000s, which was dedicated to originals and lifestyle. And what's happened in the past 15 years, I guess, is you've got this whole new phenomena, which is the collector, the sneaker heads, you know, hype. This idea that, you know, a shoe's going to be releasing at midnight online through a select group of retailers in very limited numbers, and, you know, websites are crashing, kids are camping out outside shops overnight. But what seems to have happened, what we're seeing happening now in fashion, and God knows where it's going to end, is, you know, sportswear is, you know, that 90s generation has kind of grown up, and sportswear is a huge influence on so many young and older designers. So, you know, the one thing that separates the sportswear brands from fashion is the fact that the sportswear brands still have that dedication to sports technology and are still pushing the boundaries of new sports technology. I mean, it seems unimaginable now that a shoe like the Adidas Stan Smith was at the forefront of sports technology when it was released. You know, the Adidas Superstar, the Shell Toe was revolutionary at the time when it came out, sort of 45 years ago. But now, you know, those technological features are taken purely for their aesthetic qualities. However, whilst all that's going on, you're seeing new things coming through like Prime Knit, like Boost. And, you know, for me, brands that can legitimately call themselves sportswear brands are ones that invest into technology and continue to push the envelope.